The howling wind cut through the darkness like a knife, drowning out Josephine Gardner's desperate cries for help. The March snowstorm of 1875 had descended upon the Montana Territory without warning, turning what should have been the final leg of her journey to Virginia City into a nightmare. Her hands, raw and numb from the cold, clutched the reins of a horse that no longer knew which way to go, its hooves slipping dangerously on the icy ground with each uncertain step. "Hello," Josephine called out, her voice breaking as tears froze on her cheeks. "Is anyone there, please?" The 21-year-old had left everything behind in Boston, her home, her family, her life, to marry a man she'd never met. A man who was waiting for her arrival in Virginia City, unaware that his mail-order bride was now lost in a blizzard, miles from anywhere, with night falling fast. Just when the last ember of hope threatened to extinguish within her, a deep voice cut through the howling wind. "Keep talking, follow my voice," the man called out. "You're safe now, just keep coming toward me." Relief surged through Josephine's body. "I'm here," she shouted back, tugging the reins to direct her exhausted horse toward the sound. "Please don't leave me." "I won't leave you," the voice promised, growing louder as she urged her horse forward. "Just a little further. That's it." Through the swirling snow, a shadowy figure emerged, leading a sturdy stallion. As she drew closer, Josephine could make out a tall man wrapped in a heavy coat, a cowboy hat pulled low over his face. "Thank God," Josephine whispered as her horse finally reached him. Her fingers, stiff with cold, could no longer maintain their grip on the reins. She swayed in the saddle, darkness creeping at the edges of her vision. "Whoa there, miss." The man moved quickly, reaching up to steady her just as she began to slip from the saddle. "I've got you." Josephine felt strong arms catch her as consciousness slipped away, the last thing she remembered being the surprising gentleness in the stranger's blue eyes. "Miss, can you hear me?" The voice pulled Josephine from the darkness, warm and deep. She blinked slowly, disoriented by the crackling fire and the rough wooden walls surrounding her. She was lying on a bed covered with thick furs, a quilt tucked tightly around her. "Where am I?" she whispered, her throat raw and painful. "My cabin," the man said, moving into her line of sight. In the warm glow of the firelight, she could see him clearly for the first time. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 27 or 28, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days' growth of beard. His hair, dark and slightly wavy, fell across his forehead as he leaned toward her, concern evident in those remarkable blue eyes. "Lucas Prentiss, I found you in the storm." "Josephine Gardner," she responded automatically, struggling to sit up. "I need to get to Virginia City. My fiancé will be worried." Lucas placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Nobody's going anywhere in this storm, Miss Gardner. It's the worst blizzard we've had in years. You're lucky to be alive." The reality of her situation crashed over Josephine. "How long have I been here?" "Just since nightfall. It's about midnight now." Lucas handed her a cup of something hot. "Drink this. It'll help warm you up." The tea was sweet with honey, and Josephine felt its warmth spread through her as she sipped. "Thank you for saving me, Mr. Prentiss." "Lucas," he corrected with a small smile that transformed his weathered face. "And you're welcome. Though I think your horse deserves some of the credit. Smart animal to keep moving in a storm like this." "Penny," Josephine said, suddenly worried. "Is she all right? Your mare's fine." "She's in the stable with my horses, probably enjoying being out of that weather more than either of us." He stood, his tall frame casting long shadows across the cabin walls. "You should rest. We can figure everything else out in the morning." Josephine wanted to protest. She needed to get to Virginia City, needed to explain to Harold Wilson why she was late, but exhaustion pulled at her limbs and clouded her thoughts. "What about you? she managed to ask, noticing there was only one bed in the small cabin. "Don't worry about me," Lucas said, moving to stoke the fire. "I've slept in worse places than my own floor." As Josephine drifted back to sleep, she couldn't help but wonder what kind of man would rescue a stranger in a blizzard and then give up his bed without complaint. Certainly not the kind of men she'd known back in Boston. Morning brought no relief from the storm. If anything, the wind howled with greater ferocity, rattling the cabin's shutters and driving snow against the small window panes until they were completely obscured. Josephine woke to find Lucas already up and moving about the cabin, preparing what smelled like coffee and something savory that made her stomach growl with hunger. "Good morning," he said when he noticed her stirring. "How are you feeling?" Josephine took stock of her body. Her fingers and toes ached as circulation returned, and her face felt raw where the wind had burned it, but she was alive. "Better, thank you." "Hungry?" Lucas asked, offering her a plate of beans and what looked like venison. "It's not much, but it's hot." "It's perfect," Josephine assured him, suddenly ravenous. She ate quickly, trying to maintain some semblance of the ladylike manners her mother had drilled into her, but failing miserably in the face of her hunger. Lucas watched her with amusement. "When was the last time you ate?" "Yesterday morning, I think, at the stage stop in Helena." Josephine wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, then blushed at the unladylike gesture. "I was supposed to reach Virginia City by nightfall, but the stage had trouble in the snow. The driver said we were only a few miles out when one of the wheels broke. He left to get help, told me to stay put, but—" "But what?" Lucas prompted when she trailed off. Josephine looked down at her empty plate. It was getting dark. "I got scared waiting alone and I thought I could see lights in the distance. I decided to try to reach the town on horseback." She shook her head at her own foolishness. "I should have stayed with the stage." "Maybe," Lucas agreed, taking her plate. "But then again, stage drivers aren't always the most reliable folk. He might have taken longer than expected and you'd have frozen to death waiting." He paused, studying her face. "Virginia City, you said. That's a good 15 miles from here." 15 miles. Josephine's heart sank. "But the driver said we were close." Close is relative in Montana territory, especially in winter. Lucas's expression softened at her obvious distress. "Don't worry. Once the storm passes, I'll get you there." "I can't impose on you any further," Josephine protested. "You've already done so much." "It's no imposition," Lucas insisted. "I need to head into town anyway for supplies. Been putting it off, but now I've got a good reason to go." He glanced out the window at the whirling snow. "Though it might be a day or two before we can attempt it, this storm isn't letting up any time soon." Josephine tried to hide her dismay. Harold Wilson had specified in his letters that punctuality was a virtue he greatly admired. What would he think when his mail-order bride failed to arrive on schedule? Would he even still want to marry her? "I need to send word somehow," she said. "Mr. Wilson will be concerned." "Wilson?" Lucas looked up sharply. "Harold Wilson?" "Yes. Do you know him?" Something flickered across Lucas's face, surprise, perhaps, or concern before his expression became carefully neutral. "Virginia City's not that big, I know of him." Before Josephine could ask what exactly that meant, a particularly violent gust of wind slammed against the cabin, making the whole structure creak ominously. "That doesn't sound good," she said, glancing up at the ceiling. Lucas followed her gaze. "The cabin's sturdier than it looks. Been standing for 10 years through worse storms than this." He stood, grabbing a heavy coat from a peg by the door. "I should check on the animals, though." "Let me help," Josephine offered, moving to stand. "I can't just sit here while you do everything." Lucas looked like he might object, but after a moment's consideration, he nodded. "There's a spare coat there, and boots by the door. They'll be too big, but better than nothing." Wrapped in Lucas's spare clothing, which indeed swallowed her slender frame, Josephine followed him outside. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath away despite the scarf wrapped around the lower half of her face. The snow was almost to her knees, and the wind drove icy particles against any exposed skin with merciless fury. Lucas forged ahead, creating a path for her to follow as they made their way to a small stable attached to the side of the cabin. Inside, it was marginally warmer and blessedly protected from the wind. 3 horses stood in stalls, Lucas's 2 and her mare, Penny, who nickered softly in recognition when Josephine approached. "Hello, girl," Josephine said, stroking the horse's velvety nose. "Thank you for not giving up on me out there." "She's a good horse," Lucas commented, busy checking the other animals. "Arabian." "Yes," Josephine said, surprised by his knowledge. "She was a gift from my father before I left Boston. Your father must care for you a great deal to send you west with such a valuable companion." Josephine's hand stilled on Penny's neck. "He did," she said quietly. "He passed away last summer." Lucas stopped what he was doing, turning to face her fully. "I'm sorry to hear that. Thank you." Josephine swallowed past the familiar lump in her throat. "It's why I'm here, actually. After he died, there wasn't enough money to maintain our home. My mother went to live with my sister and her husband in New York, but there wasn't room for me." She tried to keep her voice matter of fact, though the hurt of that realization still stung. "Mr. Wilson advertised for a bride in the Boston Herald. He wrote that he has a prosperous business in Virginia City and wanted an educated Eastern woman to be his wife. It seemed providential." "And you've never met him?" Lucas asked, his voice carefully neutral. "No. We've corresponded for 3 months. He seems very respectable." Josephine stroked Penny's nose again, drawing comfort from the familiar touch. "He sent money for my passage west." Lucas nodded slowly, returning to his task of checking the horse's water. "Let's hope he's worth the journey." They worked in companionable silence after that, ensuring the animals had fresh water and enough feed to last through the day. By the time they returned to the cabin, Josephine's feet and hands were numb with cold despite the borrowed clothing, and she was grateful for the roaring fire Lucas quickly built up. "You should change," he said, gesturing to her damp skirts. "I have some clothes that might work. They belong to my sister. She left some things here last time she visited." Josephine hesitated only briefly, before accepting the offered clothing, a simple flannel shirt and woolen trousers that would have scandalized her mother, but seemed eminently practical in the circumstances. Lucas respectfully turned his back while she changed behind a blanket he'd hung for privacy. "Better?" he asked when she emerged, the 2 large clothes cinched with a belt. "Much," Josephine admitted, rolling up the sleeves of the shirt, "though I doubt Mr. Wilson would approve." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "Does his approval matter so much already?" The question caught Josephine off guard. "He's to be my husband," she replied, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Of course his approval matters." Lucas didn't argue, but his skepticism was evident as he busied himself with preparing more coffee. "Tell me more about Boston. I've never been east of the Mississippi myself." Grateful for the change of subject, Josephine began describing her hometown, the cobblestone streets, the harbor with its forest of ship masts, the public gardens in spring. Lucas listened attentively, asking questions that revealed a keen intelligence and curiosity about the world beyond Montana. As the day progressed, and the storm showed no signs of abating, they continued talking. Lucas told her about growing up on a small ranch outside of Virginia City, about losing his parents to influenza when he was 16 and raising his younger sister alone, about his dreams of expanding his modest cattle herd into something that could support a family. "Is that why you live out here alone?" Josephine asked. "To save money for more cattle," Lucas nodded. "Land's cheaper this far out, and I prefer the solitude most days." He glanced around the small cabin. "Though I suppose it must seem primitive compared to what you're used to." "It's cozy," Josephine said honestly. There was something about the single room with its handcrafted furniture and crackling fire that felt more like a home than the cold, formal rooms of her father's house ever had. "You never get lonely." "Sometimes," Lucas admitted, his eyes meeting hers briefly before returning to the fire. "But loneliness is better than bad company." The words hung in the air between them, laden with meaning Josephine wasn't sure she fully understood. Before she could question him further, Lucas stood abruptly. "We should conserve the lamp oil," he said, glancing outside where darkness was already falling despite the early hour. "Early night might be best." That night, despite Lucas's protests, Josephine insisted he take the bed while she slept on a pallet of blankets near the fire. "You've done enough," she said firmly. "I won't have you sleeping on the floor of your own cabin for a second night." To her surprise, Lucas didn't argue further. "Wake me if you need anything," he said simply, retreating to the bed on the far side of the cabin. Josephine lay awake for a long time, listening to the storm rage outside and the steady sound of Lucas's breathing across the room. She thought about Harold Wilson waiting in Virginia City, about the life she'd imagined for herself when she'd agreed to become his wife. It had seemed so clear than a practical arrangement, a fresh start, security. Now, wrapped in borrowed clothes in a stranger's cabin, everything felt uncertain. Eventually, lulled by the warmth of the fire and the oddly comforting presence of the man sleeping nearby, Josephine drifted off to sleep. The next morning, Josephine woke to blessed silence. The howling wind that had been their constant companion for the past day and night had finally subsided. Sunlight streamed through the window, reflecting blindingly off the pristine snow outside. "Storm's past," Lucas said, already up and dressed, "but we've got another problem." "What is it?" Josephine asked, sitting up and pushing hair from her face. "Snow's deep. Too deep for the horses right now, especially with a lady riding." He gestured toward the window. "Come see." Wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, Josephine joined him at the window. Her breath caught at the sight. The world outside was transformed into a glittering white expanse, beautiful but treacherous. The snow had drifted against the cabin, reaching almost to the windowsill. "How long before we can travel?" she asked, trying to keep the anxiety from her voice. "A day or two if the sun stays strong," Lucas replied. "Need to wait for some of this to melt and pack down. Trying to push through now would exhaust the horses and might get us all stuck somewhere worse than here." Josephine nodded, understanding the logic but still worried about what Harold Wilson must be thinking. "2 more days," she murmured. "I suppose there's nothing to be done about it." "We'll use the time to prepare," Lucas said, moving away from the window. "I need to check the trail down to the main road, make sure there aren't any fallen trees blocking our way. And you should rest the ride to Virginia City. Won't be easy, even after the snow melts some." The day passed quickly, filled with necessary tasks. Lucas ventured out to assess the trail while Josephine insisted on making herself useful by tidying the cabin and taking stock of their supplies. When Lucas returned, red-faced from exertion but satisfied that their path would be clear enough once the snow settled, they shared a simple meal of the last of the venison and potatoes. "Tell me about your plans," Lucas said as they ate. "After you marry Wilson, I mean." Josephine hesitated, realizing she'd given surprisingly little thought to what her daily life would be like as Harold Wilson's wife. "Mr. Wilson owns the mercantile in Virginia City," she said. He mentioned in his letters that he's been expanding into banking as well. I suppose I'll keep his home, perhaps help with the books for his businesses. He indicated he wants children right away. Lucas's expression remained neutral, but his hand tightened almost imperceptibly around his fork. And that's what you want, children right away. I've always wanted a family, Josephine said slowly, though I had hoped to have some time to adjust to marriage first. She looked down at her plate, suddenly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Mr. Wilson is 38. I suppose he feels he shouldn't wait too long to start a family. 38, Lucas repeated, his eyebrows rising. That's quite a bit older than you. Age is just a number, Josephine said, repeating what her mother had told her when she'd expressed similar reservations. He's established, respected. He can provide security. Security is important, Lucas agreed, but it's not everything. Josephine met his eyes across the table. What else is there when you have no home and no prospects? Happiness, Lucas said simply. Joy, love if you're lucky. Love is a luxury not everyone can afford, Josephine replied, surprised by the bitterness in her own voice. My parents married for love. When my father died, my mother was left with nothing but memories to keep her warm. Lucas studied her face for a long moment. I'm sorry that happened to your mother, he said finally, but choosing security without happiness is its own kind of poverty. The words struck Josephine like a physical blow. She'd spent so many months convincing herself that her arrangement with Harold Wilson was sensible, practical, the best she could hope for in her circumstances. To hear her deepest fears articulated so clearly by this virtual stranger was unsettling. You don't know anything about me or my choices, she said, standing abruptly. I appreciate your hospitality, Mr. Prentiss, but I'd appreciate it even more if you'd keep your judgments to yourself. Without waiting for a response, she retreated to the far side of the cabin, pretending to busy herself with folding the blankets from her makeshift bed. Her hands trembled slightly, and she wasn't sure if it was from anger or from the uncomfortable recognition that perhaps Lucas had touched on a truth she'd been avoiding. For several minutes, Lucas remained at the table, silent. Then she heard him sigh and begin clearing away their dishes. I apologize, he said quietly. You're right, it's not my place to question your decisions. Josephine's shoulders relaxed slightly, though she didn't turn around. Thank you. But Josephine. The use of her given name made her look up, meeting his gaze across the cabin. Whatever you decide, make sure it's truly what you want. Life out here is hard enough without the burden of regret. The rest of the evening passed in strained silence, each of them finding tasks to occupy themselves on opposite sides of the small cabin. When it came time to sleep, they maintained their arrangement from the previous night without discussion, Lucas in the bed, Josephine on her pallet by the fire. But sleep eluded Josephine. Lucas's words echoed in her mind, mingling with doubts she'd suppressed for months. Was security enough? Would she find happiness as Harold Wilson's wife, or merely an absence of financial worry? And why did the thought of reaching Virginia City now fill her with dread rather than relief? Morning came, bringing with it a marked improvement in conditions outside. The sun shone brightly, and already the snow was beginning to compact and melt where it caught the direct light. Lucas announced that if the weather held, they should be able to set out for Virginia City the following morning. We'll need to pack provisions, he said over breakfast, seemingly determined to maintain a businesslike tone after their disagreement the previous evening. The journey will take most of the day in these conditions. Of course, Josephine agreed, equally formal. Please tell me how I can help. They spent the day in preparations, checking the horses' tack, packing food and extra clothing for the journey, ensuring Lucas's cabin was secure for his absence. The work required cooperation but little conversation, which suited them both. As evening approached, however, the silence began to weigh on Josephine. This was likely her last night in Lucas's cabin, perhaps the last time they would ever speak at length. Tomorrow she would meet Harold Wilson and begin the life she had committed herself to. The thought brought no joy, only a hollow feeling in the pit of her stomach. "Lucas," she said suddenly as they sat before the fire after dinner, "tell me honestly what you know of Harold Wilson." Lucas looked up from the bridle he was mending, his expression guarded. "Why do you ask?" "Because you clearly had a reaction when I first mentioned his name," Josephine said. "And because I'm about to marry the man. If you know something I should know, I'd rather hear it now than discover it when it's too late." Lucas set the bridle aside, his hands coming to rest on his knees as he considered his words carefully. "Wilson's well respected in Virginia City, like you said. His businesses are prosperous. He's a church-going man, serves on the town council." "But," Josephine prompted when he hesitated. "But he's had 2 wives before you," Lucas said bluntly. "The first died in childbirth 6 years ago. The second left him after less than a year of marriage and returned east." Josephine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the cabin. "He never mentioned a previous marriage in his letters, let alone 2. "I'm not surprised," Lucas said grimly. "It's not the sort of thing a man advertises when seeking a new bride." "Do you know why his second wife left?" Josephine asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Lucas shook his head. "She was gone before anyone really got to know her. There were rumors, but nothing concrete. Wilson told everyone she couldn't adapt to life in the territory and missed her family." It was a plausible explanation, Josephine thought. Many Eastern women found the hardships of frontier life too difficult to bear, and yet something about the story didn't sit right with her. "There's more, isn't there?" she pressed. Lucas met her eyes directly. "Wilson's not cruel as far as I know. He doesn't drink to excess or gamble away his money. But he's rigid, uncompromising, the kind of man who expects things to be done his way always." He paused. "I've seen him berate employees publicly for minor errors. I've heard him speak dismissively of women's opinions at town meetings. These aren't crimes, but they speak to his character." Josephine absorbed this information silently. It aligned with subtle hints in Harold's letters, his emphasis on proper behavior, his detailed instructions about her journey, his clear expectations for their life together. She had interpreted these as signs of an organized mind, a man who knew what he wanted. Now she wondered if they indicated something less benign. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally. "I appreciate your honesty." "What will you do?" Lucas asked, his voice gentler than it had been all day. Josephine stared into the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker. "I don't know," she admitted. "I have an obligation to Mr. Wilson. He paid for my passage west. He's expecting me." She twisted her hands in her lap. "And what alternative do I have? I can't return to Boston. I have no money, no family who can take me in." "You could stay," Lucas said quietly. Josephine's head snapped up. "Stay here in Virginia City," Lucas clarified, though a flush had crept up his neck. "Or nearby. The territory needs teachers desperately. With your education, you could find a position. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be your own life, on your own terms." "I've never taught," Josephine protested, though the idea kindled a small spark of hope within her. "I wouldn't know where to begin." "You'd learn," Lucas said with confidence. "And in the meantime, you could stay with my sister and her husband in town. They have a spare room, and Sarah's been complaining about having no one to talk to about books and music since she moved west." The offer was tempting, more tempting than Josephine wanted to admit. A chance to build her own life, to make her own choices rather than submitting to a marriage that now seemed more like a business arrangement than a partnership. But the practicalities remained daunting. "I would still owe Mr. Wilson the cost of my journey," she said. "And I have no guarantee I could find work quickly enough to support myself." "I'd help you," Lucas said simply. "With the debt to Wilson and with finding your feet, no strings attached." Josephine studied his face, looking for signs of ulterior motives but finding only sincerity. "Why would you do that for a woman you barely know?" Lucas was quiet for a long moment, the firelight playing across his features as he considered the question. "Because in 3 days, I've seen more spirit and resilience in you than most people show in a lifetime," he said finally. "Because you deserve the chance to choose your own path, not just accept whatever fate seems most convenient." He paused. "And because I think you'd regret marrying Wilson for the rest of your life." His words hung in the air between them, honest and unvarnished. Josephine found herself unable to look away from his gaze, feeling as though she stood at a crossroads with two diverging paths stretching before her, one familiar and seemingly safe, the other unknown, but somehow more alive with possibility. "I need to think," she said at last, rising from her chair. "This is a lot to consider." Lucas nodded, understanding in his eyes. "We don't have to leave at first light. Take the night to decide." Josephine retreated to her pallet, but sleep remained elusive. Her mind raced with possibilities, with fears, with hopes she'd scarcely allowed herself to acknowledge. What did she truly want from life? Security. Yes, but was security without happiness really security at all? And could she trust this man she'd known for only 3 days? This cowboy who'd found her in a blizzard, and now offered her an entirely different future than the one she'd planned. As the fire burned low and the cabin grew dark, Josephine finally drifted into a fitful sleep, her dreams filled with swirling snow and 2 paths diverging before her feet. Morning arrived with soft golden light and the cheerful sound of birds outside the cabin window. Josephine opened her eyes, momentarily disoriented before the events of the past days came rushing back to her. Today, she would either continue to Virginia City to meet her intended husband or what? Begin a new, uncertain life with only the vague promise of assistance from a man she barely knew. She sat up, looking across the cabin to where Lucas was already moving quietly about, preparing coffee and avoiding waking her. In just 3 days, this small space had begun to feel familiar, almost comfortable. The thought of leaving it, of never seeing Lucas again, created an unexpected ache in her chest. "Good morning," she said softly. Lucas turned, a smile warming his face when he saw she was awake. "Good morning. Coffee, please." Josephine accepted the steaming cup he offered, wrapping her hands around it for warmth. "I've been thinking about what you said last night." Lucas sat across from her, his own coffee untouched. "And I can't simply abandon my commitment to Mr. Wilson without at least meeting him face to face," she said slowly. "I need to look him in the eye, explain the situation. If nothing else, I owe him the money he spent bringing me west." Disappointment flickered across Lucas's features, though he quickly masked it. "I understand," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "We can leave for Virginia City when you're ready." "But," Josephine continued, meeting his gaze directly, "I'm not going to marry him. Not now, knowing what I know. Not when I have other options to consider." The smile that broke across Lucas's face was like the sun emerging from behind clouds. "You're sure?" "I'm sure that I'm not going to rush into a marriage I'm already having doubts about," Josephine clarified. "As for what comes next..." She shrugged, a gesture that felt strangely liberating. "I suppose I'll have to see what opportunities Virginia City has to offer a Boston-educated woman with a fondness for adventure." "More than you might think," Lucas said, his smile lingering. "And I meant what I said about helping you get established. My sister will be delighted to have company." They set out just before noon, with the sun high overhead helping to melt the worst of the snow. The journey was slow and at times difficult, with the horses having to pick their way carefully through deeper drifts. Lucas led the way, occasionally dismounting to check the trail ahead or clear away fallen branches. As they rode, Josephine found herself studying Lucas with new eyes. His consideration for the horses, his quiet competence on the trail, the way he frequently glanced back to ensure she was managing well, all spoke to a character far different from what she'd expected to find in the rugged Montana territory. He was a gentleman in the ways that truly mattered, not because of fine clothes or formal manners, but because of an innate kindness and respect that couldn't be taught. The afternoon was waning when they finally crested a ridge, and Virginia City came into view below them, a collection of wooden buildings nestled in a valley, smoke rising from chimneys into the clear blue sky. "There it is," Lucas said, reining his horse to a stop beside hers. "Not much to look at compared to Boston, I expect." "It's charming," Josephine said, and meant it. The small frontier town had a rugged appeal, a sense of possibility that Boston, for all its culture and refinement, had begun to lack for her. As they descended toward the town, Josephine's nervousness grew. How would Harold Wilson react to her decision? Would he be angry? Would he demand immediate repayment that she couldn't provide? Lucas seemed to sense her anxiety, riding closer so their knees occasionally brushed. "It'll be all right," he assured her. "Wilson's proud, but he's not a fool. Better to end things now than after vows are spoken." They rode directly to the Mercantile, a large two-story building on the town's main street. A bell jingled as they entered, Lucas leading the way with Josephine close behind, suddenly conscious of her borrowed men's clothing and wind-tangled hair. A thin man with graying hair looked up from behind the counter, his eyes narrowing slightly at the sight of Lucas before shifting to Josephine with evident confusion. "Prentiss," he acknowledged coolly. "What brings you to town?" "Wilson," Lucas returned with a nod. "I believe I've found something that belongs to you," he gestured to Josephine. "Or rather, someone." Harold Wilson's gaze sharpened as he focused fully on Josephine, recognition slowly dawning in his eyes. "Miss Gardner, is that you?" Josephine stepped forward, summoning all her courage. "Yes, Mr. Wilson. I apologize for my appearance and my tardiness. There was an accident with the stage and then the blizzard." "I was concerned when you didn't arrive," Wilson interrupted, coming around the counter. He was exactly as his photographs had shown, tall, thin, well-dressed, with a precisely trimmed beard and cold gray eyes that assessed her critically. "Though I can see now that my concern was warranted. What on earth are you wearing?" The disapproval in his tone was unmistakable, and Josephine felt a flicker of indignation rise within her. 3 days in a blizzard, and his first concern was her clothing, practical attire for survival in a Montana snowstorm, she replied, her voice cooler than she'd intended. "Mr. Prentiss found me lost in the blizzard and saved my life. I've been recuperating at his cabin until the snow melted enough for travel." Wilson's gaze flicked to Lucas, suspicion evident in the tightening of his lips. "I see. How? Fortunate that Mr. Prentiss happened to be in the area." "Very fortunate," Josephine agreed. "Without his help I would have frozen to death." An awkward silence descended, broken only by the ticking of a large clock on the wall. Wilson cleared his throat. "Well, you're here now, albeit somewhat worse for wear. We can still have the wedding tomorrow as planned, once you've had a chance to. Refresh yourself." His gaze lingered disapprovingly on her borrowed clothes. "I have a room prepared for you at Mrs. Hollister's boarding house until then." This was the moment, Josephine knew. She could simply nod, thank Lucas for his assistance, and step into the life she'd planned, a life of security if not happiness. Or she could choose another path entirely. "Mr. Wilson," she began, her voice steadier than she'd expected, "I'm afraid I must decline your proposal of marriage." Wilson stared at her, clearly stunned. "I beg your pardon. I cannot marry you," Josephine repeated. "These past days have given me time to reflect, and I've realized that I'm not ready for marriage, certainly not to someone I've never met before. It wouldn't be fair to either of us." Wilson's face flushed an alarming shade of red. "Not ready? After I paid for your passage west, after I've prepared everything, announced our engagement to the entire town?" His voice rose with each question. "Do you have any idea how this makes me look?" "I understand your frustration," Josephine said, maintaining her composure with effort. "And I intend to repay you for the cost of my journey as soon as I'm able. But surely you agree that it's better to discover our incompatibility now rather than after we're bound together for life." "Incompatibility?" Wilson sputtered. "You don't even know me. How can you possibly judge our compatibility based on a few days in the company of—" He broke off, his gaze shifting to Lucas with sudden comprehension. "I see how it is. Prentiss has been filling your head with nonsense about me, hasn't he? Turning you against me before we've even had a chance to meet properly." "Mr. Wilson," Josephine began, but he cut her off with a sharp gesture. "No, I understand perfectly. Prentiss has wanted my downfall for years. Ever since I foreclosed on his father's ranch." Wilson's lips curled in a cruel smile as he addressed Lucas directly. "Couldn't stand to see me happy, could you? Had to steal my bride right out from under my nose." Lucas, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, stepped forward, his expression hard. "That's enough, Wilson. Miss Gardner made her decision on her own. And for the record, my father never borrowed a penny from you. That ranch was stolen through forged documents, and we both know it." Wilson's face contorted with fury. "Get out of my store, both of you. And you," he jabbed a finger toward Josephine. "Don't think you'll find a place in this town after insulting me this way. No one crosses Harold Wilson without consequences." "Is that what happened to your second wife?" Josephine asked quietly. "Did she cross you too?" Wilson went very still, his eyes narrowing to slits. "Get out," he repeated, his voice dangerously low. "Now." Lucas placed a gentle hand on Josephine's back, guiding her toward the door. "Come on," he murmured. "This isn't going to get any better." Outside on the boardwalk, Josephine released a shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Well," she said, attempting a lightness she didn't feel, "that could have gone better." Lucas chuckled despite the tension. "Actually, that went exactly as I expected." Wilson's never been good at handling disappointment. He looked down at her, concern evident in his eyes. "Are you all right?" Josephine considered the question seriously. She had just rejected the security she'd traveled 2,000 miles to claim. She'd made an enemy of one of the most influential men in Virginia City. Her future was suddenly more uncertain than ever, and yet she felt lighter than she had in months, perhaps years. "Yes," she said, surprised to find it was true. "I think I am." "Good." Lucas squeezed her shoulder gently. "Now, let's get you to my sister's place before Wilson comes up with more accusations to hurl at us." Sarah Prentiss Cooper and her husband Michael welcomed Josephine with a warmth that brought tears to her eyes. Sarah, a lively woman of about 20 with Lucas's same blue eyes and quick smile, immediately declared that Josephine would stay with them for as long as she needed. "Any woman who has the good sense to turn down Harold Wilson is welcome in my home indefinitely," she announced, showing Josephine to a small but comfortable bedroom on the second floor of their modest house. "Besides, it's so rare to meet someone new in this town, especially someone from the East who might appreciate decent conversation. Michael, a quiet man who worked as the town's blacksmith, simply nodded his agreement, though Josephine caught the affectionate look he gave his wife when she wasn't looking. Over dinner that evening, Sarah regaled Josephine with tales of Virginia City and its inhabitants, painting a picture of a community that, despite Wilson's threats, might still offer possibilities for a new beginning. The school was indeed in desperate need of a teacher, the previous one having left to get married 2 months earlier. The town council, which, unfortunately, included Wilson, would be responsible for hiring a replacement. "But don't worry about that old goat," Sarah said dismissively when Josephine expressed concern about Wilson blocking her application. "Half the council can't stand him either. They just put up with him because of his money. Once they meet you and see your qualifications, they'll hire you regardless of his objections." Lucas, who had been mostly quiet during the meal, nodded in agreement. "And in the meantime, there are other options. Mrs. Finch at the hotel needs help with bookkeeping. The newspaper might take on someone who can write well. You won't starve." The confidence they all seemed to have in her abilities warmed Josephine, though doubt still nagged at the edges of her mind. What if Wilson's influence was stronger than they believed? What if she couldn't find work and ended up being a burden on Lucas's family? What if she'd made a terrible mistake, as if reading her thoughts, Lucas caught her eye across the table? "One day at a time," he said softly. "That's how we do things out here." Later, as Josephine prepared for her first night in a proper bed since the blizzard, Sarah knocked gently on her door with a nightgown and robe draped over her arm. "I thought you might be tired of wearing my brother's clothes," she said with a smile, laying the garments on the bed. "These should fit you better." "Thank you," Josephine said sincerely, "for everything. You've been so kind to a complete stranger." Sarah waved away the thanks. "Lucas told us how you got lost in the storm, how brave you were. Anyone who can survive that deserves a little kindness." She paused, studying Josephine's face. "He likes you, you know. I haven't seen him look at anyone that way in a long time." Heat rushed to Josephine's cheeks. "I've only known him 3 days," she protested weakly. "Sometimes that's all it takes," Sarah said with a knowing smile. "Especially when you meet the right person in the wrong circumstances. Michael and I knew in 2. She moved toward the door, then paused. "Just give him a chance, will you? He's a good man. The best I know, actually, and he deserves someone who sees that." Before Josephine could respond, Sarah slipped out, closing the door softly behind her and leaving Josephine with much to think about as she prepared for bed. The next week passed in a whirlwind of activity. True to Sarah's prediction, Wilson attempted to block Josephine's application for the teaching position, but the rest of the town council overruled him after reviewing her impressive educational credentials. By the end of the week, Josephine found herself the proud new teacher of Virginia City's one-room schoolhouse, with classes set to begin after the weekend. Lucas, meanwhile, had returned to his cabin to tend to his cattle, though he rode into town every other day on various pretexts that fooled no one, least of all his sister, who teased him mercilessly about his sudden interest in town affairs. On Saturday, a week after their arrival in Virginia City, Lucas appeared at the Cooper house with 2 horses saddled and ready. "I thought you might like to see more of the territory," he said when Josephine answered the door, "if you're not too busy preparing for school." Josephine had, in fact, spent most of the morning organizing lessons and reviewing the sparse collection of books available at the schoolhouse. But the sunshine was inviting, and the prospect of spending time alone with Lucas even more so. "I'd love to," she said, reaching for her coat. "Just let me tell Sarah I'm going out." They rode at a leisurely pace out of town, following a winding trail that led up into the foothills overlooking the valley. Lucas pointed out landmarks along the way, a creek where he'd caught his first trout as a boy, a stand of aspens where bear cubs could sometimes be spotted in spring, the distant peaks of mountains still capped with snow even as the lower elevations greened with the promise of summer. When they reached a high meadow carpeted with early wildflowers, Lucas suggested they stop to rest the horses and enjoy the view. He spread a blanket on a patch of dry ground, and they sat side by side, looking out over the vast Montana landscape. "It's beautiful," Josephine said, drinking in the panorama of mountains, forests, and open prairie stretching to the horizon. "Different from anything I've ever seen before." "Do you miss Boston?" Lucas asked, watching her face. Josephine considered the question. "I miss certain things. The libraries, the theaters, the bustle of the harbor." She paused. "But I don't miss feeling trapped there. After my father died, it was as if all the doors closed for me at once. Coming west was terrifying, but it was also the first free choice I'd made in a long time. And now, do you regret that choice?" Lucas's voice was careful, neutral, but Josephine could sense the weight behind the question. She turned to face him fully. "No," she said firmly, "not for a moment. Even with everything that's happened, the storm, Wilson, starting over with nothing, I don't regret coming west." She smiled. "How could I, when it led me to you?" The words slipped out before she could consider them, honest in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be in a long time. Lucas's eyes widened slightly, and then a slow smile spread across his face, transforming his features. "I've been wanting to kiss you since that first night in my cabin," he admitted, his voice low. "When you insisted on sleeping on the floor so I could have my own bed. I thought, this woman has more courage and consideration than anyone I've ever met." Josephine's heart fluttered in her chest. "What's stopping you now?" she asked softly. Lucas reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. "Nothing at all," he murmured, leaning forward to close the distance between them. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, a question more than a demand. But when Josephine responded, moving closer and sliding her hand to the back of his neck, it deepened into something more urgent, more honest. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing quickly, and Josephine felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine. "I know it's too soon," Lucas said, his hand still cradling her face. "I know you came west expecting a different life entirely. But I can't help feeling that the storm that nearly took your life also brought you to where you were meant to be." "With you?" Josephine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you want," Lucas replied. "Not now, not until you're ready, but someday. I'd wait as long as you need." Josephine thought of the path that had led her here, the loss of her father, the desperate plan to marry a stranger, the blizzard that had nearly claimed her life. She thought of Harold Wilson and his cold eyes, of the life she might have had as his wife. And she thought of Lucas, who had followed her voice through a snowstorm, who had opened his home and his heart to her without expectation. "I don't think I'll need very long," she said, leaning forward to kiss him again, savoring the feeling of rightness that spread through her at the contact. When they returned to town late that afternoon, cheeks flushed from more than just the ride, Sarah took one look at them and grinned knowingly, but said nothing, simply setting two more places at the dinner table and shooting her husband a triumphant look that Josephine pretended not to notice. The next months passed in a blur of new experiences. Josephine threw herself into teaching, discovering a passion and talent for education she hadn't known she possessed. The children of Virginia City, a mix of miners' kids, merchants' offspring, and a few from the surrounding ranches, responded to her enthusiasm with an eagerness that made each day a joy. Wilson continued to make his displeasure known, spreading rumors about her improper arrival in town and hinting darkly at her relationship with Lucas. But as Josephine established herself in the community, these attempts to discredit her lost their sting. The mothers of her students defended her fiercely, and even some of Wilson's business associates began to distance themselves from his more spiteful comments. Lucas, meanwhile, divided his time between his small ranch and town, gradually increasing his visits until he was spending more nights at his sister's house than at his own cabin. By midsummer, their courtship was the talk of Virginia City, the Boston lady teacher, and the quiet rancher who'd found each other in a blizzard. "People are going to talk regardless," Lucas said one evening as they sat on the Cooper's porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink. "Might as well give them something worth talking about." He pulled a small box from his pocket, opening it to reveal a simple gold ring set with a single pearl. "It was my mother's," he explained as Josephine gasped. "I know it's not fancy like what you might have had in Boston, but it's perfect," Josephine interrupted, her eyes filling with tears. "Absolutely perfect. Josephine Gardner," Lucas said, taking her hand in his, "will you marry me? Not because it's practical or secure or expected, but because I love you more than I ever thought possible, and I want to spend the rest of my life making you as happy as you've made me these past months." "Yes," Josephine said without hesitation, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "Yes, I will marry you, Lucas Prentiss." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Josephine couldn't help but marvel at the twists of fate that had brought her to this moment. Had the stage not broken down, had she not gotten lost in the blizzard, had Lucas not heard her calls for help, any one of those events might have led her to a very different life. Instead, she had found not just security but joy, not just a home but a heart to match her own. They were married in the small church in Virginia City, as autumn painted the surrounding mountains in vibrant hues of red and gold. Sarah served as matron of honor, beaming with satisfaction at the match she'd been championing from the start. The schoolchildren formed an honor guard outside the church, tossing flower petals and cheering for their beloved teacher. Even Harold Wilson eventually seemed to accept the inevitable, though he pointedly did not attend the ceremony. A week before the wedding, his clerk delivered an envelope to Josephine containing the exact amount he had paid for her passage west, along with a terse note stating that he considered any debt between them settled. Whether this gesture was motivated by a desire to clear his conscience or simply to remove any remaining connection between them, Josephine didn't know, but she accepted it with grace and relief. After the wedding, Lucas surprised Josephine by revealing that he had purchased a small house at the edge of town, close enough for her to continue teaching but with enough land attached to expand his cattle operation. "The best of both worlds," he explained as he carried her over the threshold of their new home. "You don't have to choose between the life you've built here and the one I've been working toward. We can have both." That winter, when the snow once again blanketed the Montana landscape, Josephine found herself standing at their bedroom window, watching the flakes swirl in the light of the full moon. Lucas came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, pressing a kiss to her neck. "The storm," she replied, leaning back against him. "The one that brought us together. I was so frightened, so sure I was going to die out there alone." "I still don't know what made me ride out that day," Lucas admitted. "Something just told me I needed to check the northern boundary, if I'd gone in any other direction." Josephine turned in his arms, raising a hand to trace the beloved contours of his face. "But you didn't. You went north and you heard my voice and you brought me home." "Follow my voice," Lucas murmured, echoing the words he'd called out to her that fateful night. "You're safe now. "I am," Josephine agreed, rising on her toes to kiss him softly. "Safer than I've ever been." Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside their home, wrapped in each other's arms, Josephine and Lucas were sheltered by something far stronger than walls or roof, a love born in a blizzard, tested by adversity, and built to weather any storm that life might send their way. 5 years later, Josephine stood on the porch of their expanded home, watching as Lucas taught their 4-year-old daughter, Emma, to ride her first pony. The little girl, with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determined spirit, sat proudly in the small saddle, her face a picture of concentration as she followed Lucas's gentle instructions. "Mama, look," Emma called excitedly. "I'm doing it all by myself." "I see you, sweetheart," Josephine called back with a wave. "You're doing wonderfully." The sound of a baby's fuss from inside the house drew Josephine's attention, and she turned to check on their 6-month-old son, James, who was waking from his nap. As she lifted the infant from his cradle, soothing him with soft words and gentle touches, Josephine caught sight of herself in the mirror, a woman transformed from the frightened, uncertain mail-order bride who had arrived in Montana half a decade ago. Teaching had given her purpose, but Lucas had given her a home in every sense of the word. Together, they had built a life richer and more fulfilling than anything she could have imagined during those dark days after her father's death. Virginia City had flourished as well, growing from a frontier outpost to a proper town with amenities that would have been unthinkable when Josephine first arrived. The one-room schoolhouse had expanded to 3 rooms, with Josephine now serving as headmistress and supervising 2 additional teachers. Lucas's cattle operation had grown steadily, providing a comfortable living for their family while allowing him the freedom to be present for every milestone in their children's lives. Even Harold Wilson had eventually mellowed, remarrying a widow from Helena who seemed to genuinely care for him despite his rigid nature. He and Lucas maintained a careful distance, but the open hostility had faded to a civil acknowledgement when they passed on the street. As Josephine carried James outside to join Lucas and Emma, she reflected on the strange, wonderful journey that had brought her to this perfect moment, a journey that began with a lost woman in a blizzard and a cowboy's voice calling her to safety. Of all the paths her life might have taken, she couldn't imagine one that would have led to greater happiness than the one she now walked with Lucas by her side. "Everything all right?" Lucas asked, coming up to plant a kiss on her cheek while Emma continued practicing her riding under the watchful eye of Lucas's ranch hand. "Everything is perfect," Josephine replied, leaning into his embrace as their son gurgled contentedly between them. "Absolutely perfect." And as the Montana sun warmed their faces and their children's laughter filled the air, Josephine knew with absolute certainty that she had indeed found her way home, not to the destination she had originally sought, but to the one she was always meant to find.